Hello, I'm Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformational Value Podcast. Now, today we talk with Simon Collins. Simon is the founder of Stackr, a sustainable Bitcoin mining company based in New Zealand. We talk about how Stackr is making use of renewable energy and squashing misconceptions about Bitcoin mining. We also explore how Bitcoin mining can integrate into existing industrial processes, how Bitcoin miners can better collaborate in New Zealand, and we briefly talk about Stratum V2. I do hope you enjoy the episode. If you'd like to support the show, please consider streaming some sats or boosting via your favourite podcasting 2.0 platform. Otherwise, on to the show.
There's no point saving money, is there? There's no point sticking fiat under your mattress because it is being withered away. It's a melting ice cube, as Michael Saylor says. It is like literally the worst thing you can do for your financial health at the moment is to save fiat. Maybe it was the case. We had a relatively low inflation environment over the last 10 years. We had very, very cheap money, very, very cheap fiat money. And that disincentivized saving in a different way because you could have been earning so much by farming out your fiat in very different ways. Now we have another disincentive of saving, which is that it's being inflated away. So you're earning less in relative terms than you were a year ago or 18 months ago, and you're also seeing its value, the value of what you're earning being withered away in front of your eyes. You know, where would you put it if you had the option?
No, that's all good. Yeah, no, I do hear though the return. I mean, money in the bank it's terminal at this point. There's no way to make it work. Yeah, and I think the cat's out of the bag that it is just melting ice.
Totally, and it's difficult. I mean, it's another blow for people who don't own a home at the moment in New Zealand because the best thing to do with your fiat money at the moment, if you're committed to fiat, is to knock it off your mortgage, right? Because interest rates are, pretty high. Shares are down. Bitcoin's down, although not today. We're away today. So the only thing that's actually worth doing with any fiat dollar monies, is to whittle away your mortgage. Yeah. And I've been fortunate to be able to do that over the last 12 months. It's been really good. But if you're not a homeowner, you don't even have that.
No, it certainly is a challenge, and I think that's where that's also a generational thing. For myself and a lot of my friends and peers who didn't quite get on the boat. It's sort of like we look at it and we're like, what's going on here? Yeah. And you look at with my parents and their ability to just get started at 23 and it was all good. And I think that's not quite clear to people just what the second order effects of that are, which are maybe people are delaying marriage, they're not having kids, they're not having families, they're starting to change because they feel that there's no way out of that. And in a way, in a positive way though, I think that there is more awareness that there are alternative vehicles available, things like Bitcoin, which maybe in 1970 you could buy a house in Ponsonby for $10,000. Well, today you can buy a single Bitcoin for $30,000. And that kind of thinking, which, everyone missed out on, they were too young or they weren't born or whatever, that's actually an opportunity that's present now. But because of the apathy and the lack of, there's this kind of idea that Mark Fisher came up with. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I think it applies to fiat as well. It's like it's really difficult to conceptualize what the change looks like. And so people just don't think about it.
Totally. Yeah. And this is something that I'm very keen on talking about, especially in a public forum like this, is that I was of the age that I watched the internet roll out. I watched it when I was about 13, my mum went to work in accounts for one of New Zealand's first ISPs. It was called Actrix Networks, and they were literally the people bringing the internet into New Zealand. And they used to have to set up at the top of movie theaters, escalators, little demo setups, and they'd be like, hey, people coming off the escalators, do you want to try the internet? And people would be like, what do I do? And I remember going to one of these and going, what do I do? And your mum's like, what do you like? I was like, I don't know, Radiohead. So you search up Radiohead and you chose from a directory, all that sort of stuff. Now look at it, it touches everything. we're seeing the birth of another world-changing network. We're 10 years in. Where will it be in another 30 years? Because that's the time horizon that we're looking at for total kind of penetration of this network into every facet of what we do. And I think it's really important for people who might have missed the boat on the internet. Like myself, I was just a little bit young. I could have been one of the first internet entrepreneurs if I was maybe 10 years older. Anybody who's watching the birth of these networks now really should take the lesson that this is something you've got to grab hold of, because it's the future of money, and the potential for its growth has no ceiling.
That's absolutely right. And I think the asymmetric payout here, which people have talked about, if there's a 1% chance that this thing is successful, then at the very least you need to put 1% in, but it's definitely a lot higher than that. And there's still a lot of people who are on zero.
And what was Hal Finney's numbers were even more extreme, right? He said, what if there's a 1 in 100 million chance that Bitcoin becomes the world's money supply, or the world's only form of money? Is it 1 in 100 million worth that payoff?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think one of the challenges that I've found, and having been exposed to it, not involved personally as long as many others, but having been exposed to it and sort of seeing the narrative change, and I guess from a public sense, the way it's talked about, I feel like there is a real education challenge, which you've talked a little bit about. There was an article on Stuff which was titled "If Banks Are the Problem and Cryptocurrency Probably Isn't the Answer," and you wrote a response to that, and it felt that the original article that you were responding to was quite myopic and really didn't, it was sort of out to just sort of do a gotcha,
It was awful journalism. And what is it? It's I think it's Barrett's Law or Bennett's Law or something like that, which is that it takes exponentially more effort to dispute bullshit than it does to spout it in the first place. And that's the unfortunate side effect of that article, which is that I had to write 3,000 words to combat their 500 to 750 words just to set the record straight and not to make any new points. And it was really frustrating to be knocked back from actually being a published response on the same platform that it was initially published, because that seemed to me like a really one-sided position to take for the platform, to say, well, we're prepared to publish this disinformation, but because your response is too long, we can't publish the other side.
Well, it's clear there's an educational challenge, but I feel like it is also laced with a certain facetiousness, like whether it's the energy use or the the fairness or whatever the argument is. It's sort of that there's not really a foundational logic to the arguments against it, and there's almost a lack of willingness to engage with a dialogue or logic. And so, just to circle back a little bit, I'm often, I'm reading Plato's Republic at the moment, and sort of understanding the Socratic dialogue and sort of how two people can meet in the middle on something. But to fundamentally ignore logic and just sort of talk over each other, how do you get to truth from that?
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because there is some truth in both positions, right? Bitcoin uses a lot of energy relative to some other things. Bitcoin is sometimes used for crime. So are other things. And one of my favorite phrases is from a Democratic representative in the United States. He said, "There's more to there's more to Bitcoin than ransomware. Just like there's more to money than money laundering." And that really the radical decentralization of the internet seems like a very progressive ideal, and I totally agree with that like there's more to all of these things than just what's there on face value, because yes, Bitcoin uses quite a lot of energy per computer, I guess is probably the metric by which you kind of assess that. Doesn't use a lot of energy per dollar transferred. It doesn't use a lot of energy relative to the entire architecture and infrastructure that it seeks to replace. It's about 60 times more efficient than the traditional finance industry.
Yeah, and I think even the fundamental assumption before that, which is what is energy and what is the relationship between energy and human development, which I'm very concerned, I think, at how there's this, seems like quite a coordinated attempt to really, a consistent effort to push this kind of use less, gen less. Even in New Zealand, gen less, I think it's actually a thing I've seen in the paper, and that it's like, yeah, you should be using less. And the history of humanity and civilization has always been use of generation of more energy, the further the further use of energy, cheaper energy. I mean, all development spawns from that, and so
100%.
to use less is to go back. And I mean, others have talked about this, but like if you start cutting out infrastructure and trying to use less, I mean, human development indexes start to go down,
Yep.
and we start going back, and all of the
100%.
gains made with medicine and health start actually reverting.
One of the slides that I inserted to Stackr's pitch deck recently, which was kind of a turning point in us getting traction with incubators, potential funders, all that kind of thing, is a slide that says, abundant energy and sound money are key to human thriving.
Yes, absolutely.
And there's a great website called WTFhappened in1971.com, which shows, and I think the really important thing to notice, that what happened in 1971 is that the United States moved off the gold standard and onto a fiat money standard. And that was the turning point of the end of 100 years of marginal decrease in the cost of energy per joule. So instead of paying less and less and less for energy over time, we started paying more. And that was the result of a lack of investment. Now you no longer had to invest in energy infrastructure, right? You didn't have to build more power plants. You didn't have to improve your grid. And that's why every developed country in the world has an aging power infrastructure, because you could inflate away your loss in productivity. You could create fake gains in productivity through inflation. And you can say, look at how much people are earning now. Look, their wages have continuously increased, and the amount of money generated per individual per capita has increased. And you end up with this kind of completely fake kind of economy that is now groaning under its own weight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you, I recommend anyone in New Zealand worth going out to a place like Mangakino or one of these, Central North Island hydro scheme locations. I had family who worked on those back in the day, and it really is quite phenomenal that in the olden days, so to speak. I mean, they built an entire town. Mangakino was built from nothing, and that was to build the hydro scheme. And there was a bunch of others up in that area, and they're still running. I mean, they built the dams. Some of the hardware's been swapped out, but just the feat of engineering was phenomenal. And what have we built since then? It really feels like there's not been that same focus on infrastructure. And you go there, and it's like these aging. Even Huntley Power Station. I mean, they're all ancient technology. Where's the current generation?
Yeah. A coal station like Huntley is more radioactive than a nuclear reactor. They're relics, and they need to be disposed of as soon as possible. But the challenge we all face, of course, is we're all going to be driving electric cars. I already drive an electric car. We're all going to be driving them soon. We're all going to be coming home from work at 5 or 6 o'clock, and we're all going to be plugging them into the grid at the same time. The grid cannot cope with that. That's like that's I guess the worst kept secret in energy today, is that the electrification of the vehicle fleet is going to cause major issues, and the way around it, the way to fix it and address it, is solutions like Bitcoin, which operate as interruptible load, which means load on the grid that can be turned on and off, so that you could invest in that grid with a good business case that is actually going to be used at really high proportional capacity most of the time. Mm-hmm. And as Bitcoin miners, we can enter into agreements with our retailers or our generators to only operate at certain times to make sure that we get really good rates on electricity, and that grid operators, lines companies, generators, and retailers are getting really good returns on their own investment in the grid. And the other 99.9% of the population who just want to drive an electric car, pay reasonable rates for electricity, can do that without suffering extremely high rates in electricity, or being kind of demand managed in terms of the times that you can plug in your car. And so that's what we're looking for at Stackr. We're looking to enter into arrangements with generators who are happy for us to eat up their electricity when there's very low demand for it, which is almost all day, every day, and almost all night. But we can adjust that. We can pare back our operation during the peak times, which are like 6 a.m. through 9 a.m. and sort of 5 p.m. through 9 p.m. when the grid kind of groans under the weight of use.
Yeah, I love that. And you said here on your website, Stackr mines Bitcoin and has only ever used Te Waipounamu hydroelectric power, so South Island power, hydroelectric power to do the mining, and ultimately, looking at carbon neutral sources. I mean, it's all renewable.
Absolutely. Like so I feel I feel extremely strongly that we have to move forward on reducing carbon emissions. Like I say, driving an electric car, living in the South Island, you've got a great, got a really good head start on that, because there's basically only hydroelectric energy available to you. But we really also have to, we were talking before about the kind of negative narratives that surround Bitcoin, and emissions are one, like the sources of electricity that miners have traditionally used have been a balance of like high carbon output. Kazakhstan is a big mining hub. Unfortunately, they burn a lot of dirty coal there, like not just coal, but really dirty coal, like a kind of second tier quality coal to generate their energy. And unfortunately, they get extremely good rates in the 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt range. That's not something that even the best pricing in New Zealand could never compete with. So there are some perverse incentives around the cost structures for Bitcoin mining, and especially in 2021, which I kind of refer to as the Bitcoin mining gold rush, where everybody was running to plug in any Bitcoin miners they could get, old S9s, T17s, really, really old kit, and plugging them into any power source they could, and that delayed the retirement of a lot of coal capacity in the United States. And that's where the narrative around Bitcoin and carbon emissions really kind of developed its teeth. And it's for me, it's really key. We have to move the narrative away from that. We can say, look, Bitcoin can not only be carbon neutral, it can also be potentially a greenhouse gas sink in a number of ways. We can get to that in a minute. But that miners will act responsibly and ethically in the way that we source electricity, while maintaining a really equitable monetary network. It can be win-win-win for everyone. We're demonstrating that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you said a lot of coal plant retirement was delayed, but I have a feeling that perhaps that was a perception thing. I believe there were a few that, like cases that, maybe they got used and turned into a mining operation, but my general take, it wasn't this huge number. Yeah,
but I also feel even one is too much. We don't have a climate problem, we have a climate crisis. And Bitcoin can be part of the problem, or it can be part of the solution. And keeping any coal plants online when they didn't have to be online is exactly the problem. Now, Bitcoin Mining Council today will tell you that Bitcoin is 60-40 carbon neutral to high carbon sources. So it is on balance run on low carbon energy. And that is exactly the inverse to the average for the whole planet. The whole planet runs on 60% high carbon and 40% renewable energy today, which is really good, because of course Bitcoin, in terms of its economic activity, would be one of the larger countries in the world, top 25 in terms of size, in terms of market capitalization, used as a kind of crude analogy to the economic activity of a country. But it's a big entity, it's a big asset, and it's on the right track, but it needs to continue to move down that track.
Looking at the bigger trends and kind of how you say 2021 was the gold rush, and I certainly felt that. I mean, if you look at the price of mining hardware, which is a direct relationship to the ROI and the dollar price of Bitcoin, I mean, those prices have collapsed. You can pick up cheap hardware today just because the price has gone down, and that function meant that a lot of miners were basically plugging in wherever they could and doing whatever they could. Whereas I feel that the narrative has changed a little bit, that there's this underlying current that the miners must always seek out the most sustainable and the cheapest power. And even if you've got these places like Kazakhstan, which I believe that cheap power price, is it because it's a government subsidized system, or is it just the resources are so cheap?
I couldn't tell you that. Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's an extremely low cost economy because it is, a relatively poor performer on the Human Development Index. But it's just a very cheap place to buy electricity, and it's very cheap because it's cheap inputs.
Yeah.
And this is the interesting thing about renewables, right? It's renewables have zero marginal cost for the next unit of electricity. And just to explain what that means is, the marginal cost is the cost of getting the next unit, cost of producing the next unit. So you've made 1 unit of energy. How much did that cost you? It cost you X. Does your marginal cost go up or down? And that's where economies of scale comes in. So when you've got a nuclear reactor, you've got to put more uranium in to get more energy out. And that reactor has an efficiency. And putting more uranium in after that level of efficiency doesn't get you more energy out. It gets you less per unit of input. Renewables have zero marginal cost, right? It's all capital cost. You put your solar panels out in a deployment, you've got 0.5 megawatt of capacity, and when the sun's shining on them, you get that 0.5 megawatt out. It doesn't cost you any more to create more energy. It's all pure profit from there. The thing about renewables is that they're not 24/7. Solar is only for sunny days, it's only during the day, and unfortunately for the grid, that's not generally when energy is needed. Bitcoin offers a really interesting opportunity there, which is that if we soak up that excess energy, we then have a perfectly liquid asset that we can deploy to buy more energy when the grid needs it. Not only that, you're buying that asset at an extreme discount to buying it over the counter. So there's a huge opportunity for Bitcoin to act as a form of energy storage, where renewables that are producing exceptionally when the grid doesn't demand it could potentially be deployed when the grid really needs it.
Just coming back to what you said about nuclear, though, I'm interested to drill into that a little bit. And for me, this has been a learning experience talking to miners and looking at something like nuclear. You said, the more uranium in, there's sort of a less marginal return. Marginal cost. But would that sit perhaps in the middle between something like coal, where there's a clear unit going in, you got a ton of coal going in and then this amount of power coming out, as opposed to uranium, which at the end of the day you've got the rods going and it's not as quick of a turnover on that radioactive material.
Look, coal was probably a better example, and thanks for that.
That's right.
But no, coal is a better example, right? So you can shovel a bunch of coal into Huntly and you get some energy out. You can shovel more coal into Huntly and you get more energy out. But eventually you hit diminishing returns.
And there's also sort of cut-off points where if you're going to spin up a turbine, there's, it's sort of a hard step, right? So I don't know how many turbines they have at Huntly, but say they've got 8. To turn on the 9th one, you kind of have to really bump it up. It's not like
a step change up.
Yeah, it's a step change up. Whereas some of the other things can be maybe throttled I think. Well, no, actually, I mean, I imagine it's still the generator is the step change, right? Whether you've got 1, 2, 3, like that's whether it's hydro or anything, right?
Yeah. But this is the thing. Like at the end of the day, the argument remains the same, that renewables have a zero marginal cost to produce energy. You turn it, erect your wind turbines, get them going, and then they produce energy when the wind's blowing, and you don't pay for the wind.
Yeah. No, I was lucky enough to visit a new wind farm project going on in sort of Palmerston North area, and it was really illuminating to understand from the engineer how it all works and sort of what the percentages are on these units, like how often the wind needs, how often they need to be running basically to pay for themselves. Kind of sort of some of the challenges which I still don't fully understand how it all connects together, but it really does. I think when you understand it from that engineering mathematical perspective, it really does start to connect that there is kind of price, the monetary price, and then the power, that they really can fill this interchangeable role where if there's too much power, if you can have something to soak that up, if the wind turbines are going but there's no one using it, having something in there that can soak it up, like Bitcoin mining, it really is a no-brainer.
Feels like a no-brainer, right? Like, I mean,
what would you say are sort of the political or kind of regulation challenges to actually being able to activate this? I mean, talking with energy companies, generators, I mean, are there roadblocks that they throw up? Are there flags, do you think?
I mean, let's start with the most basic, right? To deploy any sort of size of moderate to large facility, there are a bunch of consents that you need to get from local government. I know that the 6 or 8 mining containers that went in at Clyde had to be painted green to match the environment. You've got noise pollution, so this is something that we're doing quite a lot of work on, is like how we call it our good neighbor protocols. How can you baffle the sound of the Bitcoin miners, whether that's totally removed, because it's the fans that make the noise, right? These things are like each miner has 4 fans, and each miner sounds like 2 hairdryers going at once. And so when you stack 200 or 300 of these things in the same place, it's not a linear growth in the noise, but it is a sort of a flattening curve. And so you stick a bunch of them together, it's quite loud. So you do have your sort of public nuisance and civil requirements to make sure that you're compliant with any local body requirements, district plan, etc. So there's the very base level regulation. I don't think there are any governmental restrictions on entering this as a business. I think New Zealand's actually pretty open to Bitcoin as a business. I don't think it's not like China or India, who love to kind of flip-flop on banning, taxing into oblivion, expelling these kinds of businesses. Yeah, it's really for us, it's just making sure that we're compliant.
Well, that's something that's quite interesting that I have felt, having travelled and lived overseas, and that New Zealand, all in all, is an extremely open, transparent, easy place to do business. To start a company in New Zealand, you just go onto the company's website, you pay a small fee, and you're ready to go. To open a bank account, to do any of that stuff is so straightforward, and in fact, we almost take it for granted here.
Yeah, we do. We do. And I tell you when it's a bit of a shock is when it doesn't work, and that's when you tell a bank that you're starting a Bitcoin business, and you go looking for a bank account. You see a lot of doors get shut in your face.
Yes, I mean that's one example of a challenge. But generally speaking, I mean the business structures, contractual relationships, kind of rule of law, and business, it is all very clear. And I think we're in a really good spot where we're a small enough country where I think there's quite high trust as well, that someone says they're going to do something, often they kind of have to anyway, just because of the size of the country, and compared to bigger places where I've been, where it is really it can be quite quite Wild West and just running a
Yep.
business, right?
Totally.
And also the regulatory side. Maybe there are things that can feel like the sort of red tape or they're slowing you down, but ultimately there are processes and due process, and I think that can be really, it can provide a lot of business confidence to know that there is just a process you have to follow to get through.
Look, man, I think New Zealand's a great place. I'll talk about my experience. I think New Zealand's a great place to mine Bitcoin. You can buy carbon neutral energy. There are no particular restrictions on doing this kind of business. We worked very hard to make sure that we were above board and compliant with tax and GST and all that kind of thing before we really got boots on the ground. So yeah, it's a very, very fair and reasonable place to start this kind of business, and you don't have to worry about the government flip-flopping on this type of business. Like, China booted out all of the Bitcoin miners in the country, theoretically booted them all out, with zero notice. So little notice, you had people carrying individual machines over the border to Kazakhstan because that was their only way to get out of the country in time. We don't have to worry about that here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that that clarity, looking at the geography as well, the South Island has the hydro, North Island has a lot of geothermal as well, which I think presents some really great opportunities with iwi and sort of the use, excess heat, excess geothermal energy. There's so many opportunities there as well, and these townships and things which are sitting on just these geothermal assets. And
yeah, totally. And like a lot of countries around the world, like the United States, have basically capped out their potential for hydro. Like they've developed all of that. So there's very unlikely to be any more hydro added in the United States. So their rollout of renewables will have to be solar and wind generally, which they're certainly doing, especially in North Texas. There's a huge amount of wind capacity going in there, and that's been a real boon for Bitcoin miners because they can be first off the rank to consume that energy before often these wind turbines are connected to the grid.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And so, looking at the push, there seems to be a real interest globally in wind, in particular, but a lack of focus on nuclear, and this kind of idea that maybe somehow nuclear is dirty or that it doesn't quite fit with the vision of a green future. What are your thoughts on that, just generally from a global perspective, but also from a New Zealand perspective?
Man, I'm very torn. You have to ask the people of Chernobyl and Fukushima whether they think that nuclear is a particularly clean form of energy. It's great until something goes wrong, right? And then it's world-breakingly bad. And I don't know whether we can reconcile the risk with growth in nuclear and the sort of inevitable increase in risk that brings. I'm not saying all nuclear reactors are badly managed, but until there's a serious earthquake under one, you can be the best managed in the world, and it still isn't enough to offset that risk. And look, this planet is bathed in energy all day, every day. There is plenty of energy available to us from the sun, from the wind that the sun creates, from the water that runs off hills, and from the tides. We just need to be more motivated to collect it. I don't see any reason that we need to use anything that's so extremely dangerous when we're offered totally free and safe renewable alternatives. Now, that's easy to say in a warm, even air-conditioned studio in a lovely developed first world city, and if you were in an African city like Nigeria, like somewhere in Nigeria, like Lagos, or you're in Eritrea, or Somalia or South Sudan, and somebody said, yeah, well, we can give you energy at 2 cents a kilowatt, and it might even help clear up some of the smog, you probably sign up on the spot. And so it's very easy to kind of project your expectations for what energy should be like to other people, and maybe, and I guess the problem is that nuclear, and I don't want to kind of ramble too much, but I guess nuclear could be a good stopgap for the kind of energy deficiencies that we see around the world. But unfortunately, nuclear is no stopgap. These are major infrastructure deployments that take decades to develop, build, and implement, and then their decommissioning takes just as long. I don't see how you could ever compete with the renewable rollout in a modular fashion that we see around the world with sort of mega nuclear deployments.
Well, I think it's also a geography question. I mean, it's certainly not my area of expertise, but I think, with the New Zealand context of, earthquakes and just everything associated with that, certainly nuclear seems like a bit of a challenge. And I think it has been unfortunate that globally nuclear weapons and nuclear power have somehow, the whole thing has just sort of been captured into this kind of icky category, and perhaps with David Longy and that whole period, it all just sort of got swept into the same bucket. Whereas, having been to Fukushima myself, realizing that, it was, an incredibly powerful earthquake and tsunami that was just the failures cascaded, and Chernobyl, which was I think a completely different story. I mean, it was just mismanaged from the start. There was no safety involved.
It was a flawed design. That's I watched the HBO series too, and
and so looking at it, I'm kind of like, well, for baseload in larger countries, I mean, certainly if it can be away from the coast and it can be away from a fault line, I don't know if nuclear is. I feel like it could really be a powerful solution, and the unfortunate thing is there hasn't been the same investment in the technology either, so that it's perhaps not as modular or safe as it could be.
It's a difficult thing, isn't it? Because it's unfortunately the technology that's ready to go. There are plenty of other reactor types and reactor designs, like thorium, that were just as close, but unfortunately being on the ticket of the nuclear weapons development programs, fission reaction nuclear became, the most subsidized.
Well, looking at it from also the public media perspective, because that's another thing with, say, the carbon footprint question, which is like, energy use equals carbon, which is not correct. I mean, you can have energy use that's zero carbon or whatnot, but the way that in the media that these things conflate and tend to kind of compile down into real soundbite, knee-jerk, reactionary thoughts or kind of opinions, and ultimately it becomes binary, kind of good, bad,
totally
black, white.
And as you say, energy consumption equals carbon consumption or carbon emission, and that equals bad, and that we should all be turning off our lights and using LED lights. Now, we should be using LED lights because they're more efficient and they free up other energy to do more useful things with. But the other thing is we don't use LED lights when the grid really needs you to use your LED lights, which is all day during the day and all night when you're asleep. So, like energy reduction is actually, I mean, in a sense, it's bad for the grid, because when you can't demonstrate use, you can't demonstrate an investment case to do a larger deployment of new capacity.
I think the public also look at it often from a kind of a consumer perspective. They're thinking about their home or their just their personal lives, whereas really the core of the economy, if you look at the industrial base and the manufacturing base, I mean, that's really where energy comes in, and people's understanding, and even my own understanding of that, is quite limited. But I mean, you can't just use less. I mean, the machines have a lifetime. They need to be running all the time. If you're manufacturing something, the factory has to be always on. That's where shift work comes from. I
totally.
mean,
they're an asset, and you've got to sweat the asset.
Yeah, you got to keep going, and those industries are going to have agreements to purchase power at a cheaper price because they're committing up front to a fixed amount, so that they can get clarity for their own cost, and be able to price that into the goods. And we're seeing this kind of myopia, I think, still with New Zealand and globally in the West, where kind of with globalization and kind of the offshoring of manufacturing, who works in a factory these days? I mean, we don't have any exposure to that, I think, like we used to. And so our understanding of what industry means is really quite skewed, which has only been a recent development. I mean, as late as the 60s and 70s in New Zealand, there was vehicle manufacturing, there was appliance manufacturing, all of these stuff, which was because of protectionist policies. But ultimately, we had workers in factories, whereas today, I mean, there's a little bit processed vegetables, processed foods, which are factory-based kind of industry, but for the most part, our economy is a service level, and so we always think about it in terms of the consumer or the service sector. But ultimately, if you haven't got cheap, abundant, reliable energy, you don't have an economy because you can't do anything.
Yeah, as a very important point, and I think it leads me to another point, which is that, as you say, New Zealand, like many developed economies, have offshored our manufacturing capacity. We've outsourced that to China, and that's not just New Zealand companies who used to manufacture in New Zealand have now found that they get better economies by outsourcing that to China, Bangladesh, Indonesia, wherever. But it is also international developed products like iPhones, computers, turntables, TVs, which are manufactured in China and then shipped to New Zealand as part of a global economy. Now we're busily patting ourselves on the back for being 75% plus renewable energy generators in this country, and we admonish China for being largely fueled by high carbon energy sources, but they're manufacturing our products. If they stop manufacturing products, we don't have them. We don't have new TVs, we don't have new phones, we don't have furniture, cars, we don't have tires, all that stuff. And so it's really important to recognize that we have outsourced that carbon, and it's not kind of tenable to me to say, well, I'm so great, I buy from X generator and they're carbon neutral, while tweeting that or posting that from a phone that you bought from a Chinese company, because that carbon was still burnt on your, for your benefit.
Yeah. It's sort of the overlap between the concept of the nation state and these kind of borders, when a lot of these issues are global issues. And the same with in the agriculture piece. You can New Zealand can have the greenest agriculture in the world, but we end up just importing the net loss from countries that aren't doing it in a sustainable way, because we are green by virtue of not being able to export or import from countries that are less green, and then it's not our problem anymore. And so that's like with, as you say, with the manufacturing. We don't do it here. If we did it, we probably wouldn't have the economies of scale. So it would actually be less clean than doing it in China, where you get a huge factory doing a huge output. It has a higher carbon footprint, but the per unit cost is going to be less than trying to do it in Hamilton.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting concept, and I think it's challenging if you go up one level, which is the political. We are living in an increasingly polarized world, multipolar. Politically speaking, there's a lot of challenges right now, and so there's sort of almost a lack of engagement with these more global ideals, which seems like it's been a bit of a backward step. I think trying to get countries to agree on things now is harder than ever. It's always been a challenge, but in a multipolar world, what does it look like where countries aren't necessarily even talking to each other, and we've got these blocks forming?
I think this is why something like Bitcoin is really important, because we have several states around the world where it feels very unfair to hold their citizens responsible for the actions of their government. And the obvious ones are Russia at the moment with its invasion of Ukraine, and the sanctions placed on that economy. North Korea, whose citizens have all lived under an oppressive regime for more than 2 lifetimes, to Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, Zimbabwe, South Sudan, Turkey, Libya, who all suffer under extremely poor financial policy regimes, which has seen their currencies become, worthless in an extremely short amount of time. Bitcoin allows anybody to take control of their financial health and wealth, irrespective of the actions of their government. And I feel like that should be like a check on government action, right? If you have an empowered population who could simply choose to opt out of a poorly managed economy, surely that should give governments some motivation to do a better job. I mean, this is a bit of an aside, but I found it incredible this week that Ghana's inflation rate was 88% last year. And so the IMF have declared that they must install a currency board to address the rate of inflation in that country. Now, what does a local currency board offer a country whose inflation rate is purely, basically, is caused by largely global pressures? Inflation's high everywhere.
Looking at the evolution of nation states as well, and the evolution of sovereign currency, there feels like there's this kind of interesting historical piece which people aren't really familiar with, but the fiat systems which are failing globally, and they have been doing so for since the beginning. I mean, this isn't a new thing. It's just that now it's starting to happen a little bit more closer to home. I mean, we're starting to see challenges in New Zealand. I think inflation here is high, and I don't know if it's going to relinquish anytime soon. I mean, in the US, they're changing the way they measure it, but still, 5% is the new 2% for inflation. The bottom, the floor of inflation. What does it look like to remove the ability of the state to have to inflate the monetary supply, to create this inflation in the first place, and then setting a currency board, doing any of these things, it's like you're just still within the problem space. You're not really trying to come up with a solution.
That's exactly my point. What does a toothless entity mean to require the creation of another toothless entity to commentate on a phenomenon which is out of the hands of anybody in that country to manage? It just seems crazy. So, look, I subscribe to Michael Saylor's vision of hyper-Bitcoinization, which is globally 5 or 6 currencies will survive. Probably the US dollar, the yuan, the euro, maybe the yen, and Bitcoin. And your savings will be stored in Bitcoin, and you'll use a Lightning wallet to spend your chosen local currency, whether, so United States, so Canada, United States, Latin America probably use $1 as their base unit of spending. And you'll spend dollars against Bitcoin from your wallet. The rest of the world might choose, the Asia Pacific might choose yuan or the yen. The home countries of those currencies will use them. They'll still be very powerful levers that large economies can use to pull to manage their economies, but smaller currencies, the New Zealand dollar, Australian dollar, things like pesos, will just not be viable and will become cost prohibitive to implement, produce, and manage. And so I think actually at the end of the day, it'll be a huge weight off these countries' minds to not have to manage ever increasingly more unstable currencies.
Coming back to the piece of these kind of future currencies, I still feel like the sort of the brand affiliation the New Zealand dollar, or perhaps in the future the New Zealand digital dollar, if a CBDC comes along. It's almost like that's just the front end that you use, where the actual settlement, the international settlement, the kind of the arbitrage will be on the Bitcoin standard, and there will be this transitionary phase where, you know, we're still using New Zealand dollars because certain institutions are required to hold them, and thus they're required to use them. And perhaps that is a transition like what we saw with the New Zealand pound through to the New Zealand dollar in the 60s, where one day it just kind of took effect and there was a peak price where, you know, this amount of New Zealand pounds turned into this many New Zealand dollars. I have a feeling that will take place, but it will be the New Zealand dollar to the New Zealand digital dollar, which will have these CBDC qualities, perhaps a linear release schedule, you know, all of these negatives of a CBDC, but it will sort of float along. But over time, more and more people will start to flick between the two, and once we have the two options available, a Bitcoin option and a New Zealand CBDC, which is increasingly surveillance based, people will start to sort of slowly move towards one or the other, and perhaps they still need a peg out to pay their taxes or to pay whatever. Maybe there's certain companies that are required to hold that New Zealand digital dollar, but it becomes kind of a plurality of currencies. I'm not sure how clear the roadmap for something like that is, or what the field of possibilities are, but it seems like it won't be necessarily a clean-cut transfer from one system to the other. It might be quite a messy transitionary phase where we sort of nudge one way or the other as the government tries to hold on to its control ultimately, which I think it will try to hold on.
Yeah, I mean the issue for governments with giving up a fiat standard is that which Safadine Amos makes in the Bitcoin standard, which is that no government, either austerity, right-wing, small government based, or, you know, tax and spend left-wing, can afford its election promises. There just isn't enough money in any system for governments to actually pay for what they do on a daily basis, whether they want to strip it all back, whether they want to expand the state sector. And that's why fiat money has to exist for governments under the current model. They can't afford the things that they spend it on every election cycle.
Yeah, certainly, even being based in Wellington here and being one of the few people who works for themselves or in a private company, you know, a lot of my friends, a lot of people here work for the government, and just the insanity of the lack of consideration for how much things cost. You know, when you're in government, it's actually disincentivized to go under budget because you lose that for the following financial year. You know, the accountants will come to you and say, hey, well, you know, can you just spend this money somewhere? Otherwise you lose it. And this lack of incentives for making good deployments of money is part of this kind of cancerous growth of the public sector, and you know, we're seeing all of the kind of the outcomes of that. And I often think, well, what would it look like if you flipped it a little bit and said, you know, our government only had as much spending possible capabilities as something like a council or a regional local councils, which don't have the money printer. And so the Wellington City Council has to run a budget. You know, they get in trouble if they run out of money. And they can do things like, you know, charge for car parks and charge rates, but ultimately they have to deliver and they have to run a tight ship. And so is this sort of the end game of this Keynesian kind of big government, you know, just keep growing this growth, and this is, you know, Bitcoin represents sort of a pushback on that.
Yep, I think so. I mean, the whole world has, as we know very well, the whole world has drunk the Keynesian Kool-Aid, as I've seen it described, even though it's kind of demonstrably, through study of the real world, doesn't bear out as economically feasible. I'm also not perfectly convinced of the Austrian school either, like myself. I think that probably what really exists in the real world is a kind of hybrid economic model where growth is good and achievable, but it has to be growth that's actually born of innovation rather than growth for the sake of growth through debt and debt financing and management of an interest rate based growth model.
Absolutely, and I think that kind of paper gains that we've seen, and which we've kind of grown up in, really, you can kind of put money into things, and it's there's no productive output, and the decay of everything around that is quite evident, and we're starting to kind of grapple with that, and also just the social and cultural implications, I think, of that kind of thinking, which I often think is that the time preference has slowly gotten closer and closer to zero. And so in society today, I mean, even just in the last 10 years in Wellington, just the decay, general decay is quite clear to me, having left and come back. It wasn't it's sort of a gradual thing. It was quite a marked difference between when I was here 10 years ago. And I feel like a lot of that can trace its roots back to just a decay in kind of core values, core thinking around, is the future going to be better or worse? And I think the general consensus from a lot of my friends and people is that, I'm not really thinking about the future. With everything going on, it feels so negative, and people just become apathetic about it. And so you're incentivized to spend now, enjoy the moment, this kind of late stage approach to life, which ultimately leads, becomes self-fulfilling. You get breakdown in relationships, all of that stuff, the social contract, all of that stuff starts to kind of get sucked into this quite negative spiral, and that's been the classic history of societies over time, right? What I am interested to circle back a little bit, though, is with Stackr and your mining operation, just understanding a little bit more about your thoughts on mining in New Zealand in regards to collaboration and I guess bringing mining into the spotlight in a positive sense, and how these benefits, which we've talked about, for the grid, there's also economic benefits. I mean, having precision hardware manufactured in New Zealand, in the sense of warehouses, all of the, not necessarily the miners themselves, but everything around that, the precision engineering for making a facility. All of these are kind of benefits for that sort of industry in New Zealand. I mean, it's not really spoken about, though, in the media. Why do you think that is?
Well, I still think Bitcoin's a bad word in New Zealand media. We started by talking about the article that I had to respond to. That's the kind of narrative that makes it to the media in New Zealand. I also remember, I think it was Kim Hill, and I think it was either the local manager for Lake Parami, who are an international mining organization or company who have facilities in New Zealand, who got absolutely the shit kicked out of him by Kim Hill on the radio. And that's the narrative, and I don't think people want to talk about mining in New Zealand, because I think that people still see it as pointless, or and you'll excuse me because I struggle with the words here, because I don't see it as pointless. I can't describe anything more worthwhile than Bitcoin as a agent for change in the world. So I'm very confused, but I recognize that the narrative that seems to be around is that of quite negative. One of the first renewable generators that we approached with the idea that we might put a facility on their generation site said that no thanks, we're not into the greenwashing of cryptocurrencies. And I can't pass that in my own head. Like, how is it greenwashing to just want to create a business that's carbon neutral? Yeah,
I also feel, coming at this again, so my because a technical understanding of mining is a bit limited. Like, it is a whole field, right? And the electrical side, the kind of the making it work as well. I do respect the amount of work involved to kind of make stand an operation up, and just the capital involved in that. But looking at it from more the cultural and I guess PR side, which is a little bit of a dirty word, looking at the propaganda side, but I feel like it is quite a concerted effort from the mainstream media to really paint it in a certain way. And there's this kind of thing at the moment where it's sort of what they say is literally the opposite of what the truth is. And so this I often think, how do you respond to that, because you can't necessarily play play into their game, because even if you come back with quite logically sound arguments, as you have done with your response to that article, it still sort of falls on deaf ears because they're not ready to listen.
They're not ready to listen, yeah. I think, and that's the unfortunate thing. I've said this before in other conversations. I drive an electric car, so from my perspective, petrol cars are pointless, worthless, and the infrastructure should be dismantled and nobody should be allowed to drive one, because I don't use them. I don't use petrol stations. I don't need oil refining. I don't need oil extraction from the ground. I don't need the carbon emissions that they produce. But I'm not the arbiter of those decisions. I don't get to decide that. Putting yourself in the position where you get to decide what is okay to spend energy on and what isn't is awfully grandiose, isn't it? Don't you think?
Well, yeah. I mean, coming back to the sort of central planning piece, like that ultimately leads to shortages and just failures and starting to ration things out. And
I guess that's where people get to, right? They're like, well, if you use this energy for X, it's not available for Y. But the market for energy is far, far more dynamic than that. As we've discussed here today, there are times of the day when energy is abundant and there are times when energy is a bit tight. Now, there are several ways that we can address that, but we can only address it through dialogue. We can't address it through closed doors. And as we discussed earlier as well, I have freedom in this country to start any kind of business I want, as long as it's not prohibited in some way. And so I've chosen to start a Bitcoin business. I've started Bitcoin mining business. And part of that is that I buy quite a lot of electricity. Now, I pay for that electricity, right? I don't not pay for it. I give it to the people who sell electricity and then make investment decisions about how much capacity should be available to sell as electricity. So the more electricity I buy, surely the more signal that gives down the chain of, well, we need to invest in capacity. And that should, in theory, bring down the price of electricity for everybody else through economies of scale. Again, these are arguments that we could make if the door was open for discussion.
Yeah, it feels like it's a challenge because the world globally is facing a lot of similar challenges. Every country, but also globally together, we're facing a lot of similar challenges. And as a response, there's almost this kind of nesting behavior where people really want the government with the big G to really kind of come and help them. And I feel like this presents both an opportunity but also a very dangerous proposition where the government response, which always will be to control, to ration, to limit, to be austere, all of these classic things that you see, and it only leads to worse outcomes for people. But there's this sort of trust that only government can solve the problem, when necessarily they're the worst ones qualified to actually help.
Yeah, I mean, I see the role of government as like the guy who controls the gate on a sheep farm, right? You've got a run of sheep and you've got two different channels for them to fly down, and you've got a person who stands there and flips the gate from side to side, and that's what a government should be doing with money, right? Money comes in through taxation, and they're sitting there and they're like, okay, well, we've got a set of priorities. We need to get X sheep into all these different areas, and we're just going to move the gate along. They've obviously got a far more complex set of gates, but that's sort of what a government's role is in kind of controlling an economy. And then you've got these kinds of pools of sheep or money to kind of apply in certain areas. Actually feeding grass to the sheep is probably a step too far, if I was to really stretch that analogy to beyond its breaking point. Because, eventually the market kind of has to create signal for itself to follow. It's just going to be really interesting to see where and when the interface between Bitcoin and government occurs and where it occurs hardest, because I think there will be a point where so many people use Bitcoin for savings, they will use Lightning for payments, and there'll be a New Zealand dollar stable coin on Lightning, just like Jack Mallers' Strike in the States. And so many people will be using that as a means for payments that the government will have to go, wow, we really need to consider what the policy implications are for having a non-government based payments infrastructure that is so widely used, we either have to enable it and work with it, or we have to put some controls and limits on it. And again, I don't think New Zealand's the kind of country that does that. So I'm really interested to see how the government comes to the party on the implementation of a system that it doesn't necessarily control. Is it as simple as making it legal tender? Is it letting... Because my perfect outcome for a hyper-Bitcoinized world is one where the government issues its money on Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying before about the front end and the back end. Like, just you still can get cash and you can still get New Zealand dollars, but it's a Bitcoin backed.
Exactly. I mean, so this is something I find really interesting. We're seeing a bit of an uptick in the number of kind of new point of sale payments systems, right? There's Dollar, Dosh, these kinds of things, and they're all run on this new kind of open banking protocol, and that's very cool and everything. But everybody who's operating these new systems has to pay to operate a network. That network isn't free. It costs them to run. They have to make it up through fees, usually fees to the merchant in terms of subscriptions, and then a layer over the top, which you either pass on to the consumer or you absorb yourself as the merchant. With Bitcoin, and particularly Lightning, the network already exists, and it's run by tens of thousands of people around the world who are motivated, maybe millions of people around the world, there's certainly millions of computers around the world who are focused on creating that base layer so that it exists for anybody to use. And why would you not take advantage of that? It's the most pristine piece of public infrastructure that's ever been invented, and it's there for a government to pick up and go, this is far better than anything we could scope, build, implement, run, maintain, and it already exists, and the cost to utilize it is next to nothing.
Yeah, I'm been really interested in following two trains of thought along that line. One is what the Reserve Bank of Australia is doing with their CBDC trials, and then also some of the recent requests for submissions from the New Zealand Reserve Bank. So starting with Australia, they did a trial. I think it's already been done and concluded, which was a very closed kind of mini federal CBDC trial. But what really struck me was they were building it on a ERC20 token. But to actually get involved in that project, you pretty much had to already be a bank. Like the barrier to entry was so high, and the limits were so stringent that you couldn't just come along and build. And I thought that was really interesting, that kind of closed source approach, because if you compare that with what's going on with Lightning, with just all of the developments that are happening in the Bitcoin space, like one or two people can actually build, or a single person can build something on Lightning, and one or two people perhaps could start a company. There's obviously kind of legal implications, but to actually build, to actually get access to the network, there's no gatekeepers.
No,
it's all there.
I would be horrified to see a CDBC built on any other crypto network than Bitcoin, simply because the proof of stake model is so doomed to eventual failure through centralization.
Yeah,
that it surely is too much of a risk for any government to sign on to. Now, when Ethereum was proof of work, you could potentially make the argument that it was a versatile enough programming interface to use that you could create very programmable money, but they moved to proof of stake, and now most likely large centralized entities are going to take control of that blockchain and make it extremely dangerous from the perspective of well, first of all, it has a variable monetary policy, which means if you're going to spend billions on rolling out a CDBC on Ethereum, you risk that a centralized entity will change the terms underneath you, and then you have to either work with that or walk away. And that just can't happen on Bitcoin, right?
And so that's the Australian trial, which I was really interested in. I read a lot into that. I read the paper, but just bring it back to New Zealand. So in 2021, they did the Reserve Bank of New Zealand did a request for submissions on CBDCs, and innovation in private money, and that's sort of where we're at now. I think it was December last year that they came out with the second kind of statement paper, really talking about their position. And I read it thoroughly. It was a huge document, and I mean, I'm not an expert in the space, but just generally, as a layman reading it, my actual take on it was that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand are actually relatively open, I think, to the fact that this is something that's out there, that innovation will happen in this space. And they still were throwing in a lot of words around like value anchors, and kind of sort of assuming, I think, with a bit of pride, that they are going to have a role in all of this. But ultimately, if you look at some of the partnerships they had in the past with, say, rolling out FPOS, it was the Reserve Bank and the banks collaborated, starting with petrol stations. That was the first point where FPOS was deployed. But it was this sort of public-private partnership to actually bring that, and it was quite groundbreaking at the time. Mm-hmm. And a lot of countries haven't, like, they're still on cash. Like FPOS, in terms of just the technical improvement, for payments. Today it certainly is strained, and I think there's a lot of criticisms to be had. But I mean, FPOS was successfully deployed, and we're now in a world where cash is pretty hard to come by in New Zealand, for better or for worse. But the point is, this statement paper that came out really sort of indicated that they are open to discussion around innovation and private money.
Yeah, I was fortunate to have a brief chat with somebody who's an advisor on the Reserve Bank CDBC project. They are comfortably into a phase 2 kind of scoping space, and he was good to talk to, because look, I see CDBCs as an inevitability, and so what you would hope is that they are implemented thoughtfully and carefully and with privacy in mind. So what I know about this guy, he is a Bitcoiner. So, and in fact, he's given talks at the Reserve Bank about Bitcoin before, and so they're at least aware of the space. He's on the board, not necessarily the board of decision makers, but on the board of contributors, and I guess thought leaders who are contributing to the project. So at least we have some representation in that space.
Perhaps not as much as we would like, though. I feel like the people who get talking time with government and Reserve Bank are either shitcoiners who are also Bitcoiners. And
that is the case here too. Look, I think, my view for how Bitcoin becomes the predominant monetary network is that it's going to be a kind of a silent revolution. It's just going to creep in very slowly. It's going to be like the internet. It'll creep in slowly. Its utility will slowly increase. It'll get easier to access. It will become more fundamental to the way that cool stuff is built. At the moment, not a lot of cool stuff is built on Bitcoin. You can send Bitcoin to yourself and to exchanges, and you can hang on to Bitcoin. And that's its role. As it becomes the predominant financial network or monetary network, it will just have increasing utility. Meanwhile, it's still going to be a great asset to hold, and that is the other way it's going to seep into the kind of collective conscious, is that it's going to become really silly to not have some Bitcoin in your portfolio.
Well, certainly. I mean, just myself, I've been able to get double digits number of people using or holding Bitcoin, and one or two of them have done that and then got out of that position.
Yeah.
I gave someone a little bit of Bitcoin to get started, and then they donated it to the Ukrainian war effort, which I thought was interesting. But that was their decision, so they're now back on zero. But for the most part, once people start holding, they don't go back to not holding.
I mean, like, how much easier is it to send money to another Bitcoiner than to send money between two New Zealand banks, or even somebody in the same bank?
Well, I mean, it's completely order of magnitude easier.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy.
So no, that's all really interesting. I've just got a couple of things I would love to get your thoughts on as well. Just come back to the mining piece. So number one, there's still this challenge with the mainstream media kind of perceptions of mining. Do you think that mining in New Zealand is a bit of a secret squirrel club, in the sense that people aren't really talking about it? It's maybe hard to even know who's who or what's what. Do you think there's an opportunity for just more collaboration between miners publicly, more forums perhaps for people to kind of share knowledge or
Definitely. Yeah. So you've got a two-part question there, right? Let's start. I am a bit disappointed that the miners that we know of are not more present and accountable to have the discussion of Bitcoin and mining in New Zealand. I know that there are several partnerships with different of the sort of second tier generators, like hydro generators in the South Island, who have mining on site, and those are sort of unnamed companies. I respect anybody's option to stay under the radar and to not dox themselves. Maybe they're just happy to run a little business in mining, and they had the kit and they, were able to deploy through personal networks or something and get good rates on electricity. But it would be really good to have some visibility over who's operating, not because of a competition. I don't see Bitcoin mining as particularly competitive. Your competition is against the whole network, and your competition is against the difficulty rate and your price of inputs, which is electricity. So yeah, I really wish we were talking more openly about mining Bitcoin in New Zealand and how it's a really good business, because it's a great business, and New Zealand's a great place to mine because the rest of the world has seen skyrocketing energy prices over the last 12 to 18 months, and we all know why. Not just inflation, but war in particular. And so our prices relative to the rest of the world in terms of energy, and maybe I shouldn't be saying this too loudly, is pretty good. We're seeing quite reasonable increases in price over time compared to the rest of the world. It's important to put that qualifier of compared to the rest of the world, because some people are coming off long-term pricing contracts in New Zealand and balking at what they're looking at paying over the next 5 or 10 years while they look to lock in their new contracts. I think there's a huge amount of value in just having a network, like just having a network of people to talk to discuss with. That's why we have conferences. That's why we have meetups. That's why we have social networks and like corporate networking events and stuff. And the idea that I don't have another like corporate scale miner to talk to feels like a real bummer.
Well, I'll give you an analogy. So I was at the BitKiwi meetups in Wellington end of last year, and the parabolic growth in my connection to other Bitcoiners, my involvement in projects, kind of skill matching, all of this stuff really took off when I actually was able to start meeting people in real life and connecting with New Zealand Bitcoiners. And that forum for that, which was a little bit, again, mining is kind of its own thing in the sense that you've got the hardware, you've got the engineering piece. It is a lot different to some of the stuff that I'm looking at, which is more like, the kind of the creative, the websites, the kind of the soft stuff. But still being able to meet people in real life has been a game changer. And I feel like if there was more, looking at it from the outside, if miners were able to communicate more and kind of build a bit of a voice, it would also mean that just in terms of dealing with government and just kind of having that body of people ready
totally
for advocacy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly that. I totally agree. One thing though that I think is worth mentioning is that I have a belief, and please somebody prove me wrong, that the majority of large-scale mining capacity in New Zealand is internationally owned, and so that's not something that it's not something that they would probably see as a priority, is engaging with the local New Zealand Bitcoin community. They've got a business, they've got one in their home country or what have you, and all they really care about is the extraction of cheap energy and tax-free profit to their own country. So what we are doing at Stackr is we're building a homegrown New Zealand-owned Bitcoin mining company for the benefit of Bitcoin, which is global, but also for New Zealanders. I want to pay the right amount of tax in New Zealand. I want to keep Bitcoin wealth in New Zealand, and I want to create wealth through jobs and career opportunities in New Zealand.
I've just got two other sort of talking points that I'm really interested in as well. So one would be just quickly your thoughts on Stratum V2, and if how much you follow or you're interested in some of these sort of protocol changes and developments that affect miners.
Yeah. So so do you want to explain, or do you want me to explain what these are?
Oh yeah, if you could,
cool.
please.
So on the internet, we use HTTP, HTML, TCP/IP to kind of connect computers up and exchange information. And in Bitcoin and in mining, we use what's called Stratum. And Stratum has a distinct type of connection protocol that miners use to connect either to pools or almost exclusively to pools nowadays, because nobody solo mines, or to the Bitcoin network, and it's called Stratum. And there's an original Stratum, and then there's now a V2, and obviously with a V2 you kind of expect more features, more efficiency, better speed, all those kinds of outcomes, and that's effectively what we get. There is massive variation in the uptake of this though, and so Stratum was developed out of one of the original mining pools, which is used to be called Slush Pool. Now it's just called Brains. Brains is the operating system that they create, which runs parallel to the stock firmware of mining computers. And they're obviously very active in research and development in the software side of Bitcoin mining, which is a real benefit to miners, because they tend to squeeze quite a lot more efficiency out of the kit than the stock software does. And that's a really important part of the efficiency margin and profitability equation for miners, is being able to squeeze as much out of these machines as possible. So Brains, as an entity or as a company, have developed Stratum V2. Look, we try to mine to several different pools just to sort of spread our risk, and Brains is one of them. And so it's great to see that it is interesting to use these different software protocols to see whether you do get better efficiency and better, more stable connection to your pool. And I have to say though, real world results don't really show a huge amount of benefit, and I think probably the main benefit we see is when we connect to a pool with a node or a server that's closer to us than any better software connection.
No, thank you very much. And then the final thing that I was interested in is just come back to the sort of ancillary services and things that can be done with mining. I know that obviously heat is an output when you've got a whole bunch of computers in a warehouse running. What are the opportunities here? What sort of innovation do you think can happen when you've got a resource like this in a place like New Zealand? I mean, what can we do with that heat?
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? Because in mining we talk about the Nakamoto moment, and that is the moment where Bitcoin mining no longer becomes feasible unless you're getting free or zero or negative cost energy. So negative cost energy, of course, is energy that you're actually paid to take away, and there are several ways that might happen. Stranded energy is a good example. That's energy that can't be connected to the grid for some reason, but has to be produced, whether that's through flaring of methane gas or greenhouse gases at oil drilling and natural gas drilling and stuff. So yeah, we talk about this moment, and it's a long way in the future, but that is the trajectory, which is that the cost of mining is going to trend toward or the cost of your inputs has to trend towards zero in mining. Whether or not that actually occurs, I don't know, because your cost per hash is going down so quickly over time. Anyhow, coming back to your question, look, we run trials at Stackr. We've run trials on firewood, on drying firewood. It's an extremely fast way of drying firewood, and so We don't have a well set up facility here, but that's something that we would certainly look at trying to implement if we ever shifted again. We are running trials at the moment on growing plants that like high temperature environments. We killed our first batch of chilies because rather than a lovely 38 or so Celsius, which they really like, it got to about 50 Celsius in what we call our hot box, which is a big box that we use to collect hot air and vent it out of the roof. So yeah, there are lots of opportunities: heating houses, heating pools, growing food, drying firewood. The reality is that heat is another form of energy, right? And so it seems insane to me to waste it by venting it out of the ceiling. We have a sort of a short list of ideas, but what you've got to find is kind of a confluence of conditions, because one of the things that I think would be perfect, right, is growing is in sites where you grow medical marijuana. My understanding is that crop loves warm temperatures and loves airflow. The problem is in Nelson, where the majority of medical marijuana is grown, they don't get a great price per kilowatt for energy. So you might be offsetting some of the cost of heating these facilities, but your cost of inputs is far higher than you'd like. And so you've got to find a space where the confluence is better. So Lower South Island, where there's a lot of forestry and logging, may be a good fit for the firewood thing. Over winter, you might find yourself paying $199 a kilo for chilies in a supermarket, right? I like to cook, so I have good visibility over that myself. So one of the things I think is growing food out of season, sort of staple foods out of season that otherwise might see really high increases in price. If you could pump the excess energy, the excess heat from a facility over a crop, a cash crop, that would seem like a really good utilization of the excess heat. So look, we have a lot of ideas around that, and we're really working hard to find something that is A, sustainable, B, is going to stick and there's a market for, C, doesn't detract from the core business or cause too much more overhead or change our kind of cost of input pattern, or D, kind of be so heavily reliant on 100% uptime that because we operate on a spot model, if we have to shut down for a while, then it won't be adversely affected. So yeah, no, I got to stop.
That's good. I think we've really covered a lot of ground today, and really that last piece I'm really interested in it as well. I think with just with climate change and some of the challenges that you get from being out in the elements with certain crops. I know, for example, tomatoes in New Zealand are purely glasshouse grown.
That's right, and also a lot of those glass houses, because they're old, are coal-fired.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and having just a little bit of exposure to that sector myself through some of my other work, sort of knowing that, things like berries are all grown undercover, and certain crops, you certainly in the South Island, the temperatures just aren't there for other crops that you would be able to grow further north. So it definitely opens up some opportunities that really connect back to sort of New Zealand's roots with agriculture.
100%.
But look, I think we might wrap it there, Simon. I think we've really covered some quite interesting, quite broad topics, and I'm really sort of impressed with, I guess, your take on the industry. It seems like you're really plugged into sort of what's going on at various layers, and sort of not just the mining piece, but sort of some of the larger considerations. I think this has really been quite illuminating.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I got into mining by falling into the Bitcoin rabbit hole and realizing that this is what I want to make my life's work. And the way that I saw the opportunity there was to provide the service, the one service that I knew that I could, because I've been a hobbyist miner for a long time. So the one thing that I knew I could contribute to the community and to the space and to the protocol was to operate mining, and doing it in New Zealand where we're further decentralizing the network, because network centralization is a real issue. With the large kind of mega miners in the United States, they're pulling the centralization not just to one country, but also just to a cohort of very, very large businesses. So sort of great to see them falling over their shoelaces over the last kind of 12 months. yeah, so like this is my contribution to Bitcoin and its adoption and stuff.
Just as a final piece, if people want to follow the Stackr story and if they want to find out more about what you're doing, what is there anywhere you want to direct them to? Any sort of websites or places where they can sort of follow along or find out more about your business?
Yeah. So stackr.co.nz. That's Stackr with no E, stackr.co.nz, and we've got a blog. There will be quite a lot more comms coming from us soon. So yeah, we'll definitely keep an eye on that. I'm not very good on Twitter, but we do have a Twitter. You need to search it out though.
Yeah, I'll search it up and I'll throw it in the show notes.
Yeah.
All right, so that's Simon from Stackr. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, man. It's been great.